The 1980s looked like the future. Digital dashboards, turbo badges, and space-age styling everywhere. But behind the cool looks, many cars were disasters waiting to happen. Cheap parts, weak frames, and terrible safety turned some of them into rolling death traps. They rusted fast, crashed hard, and sometimes even caught fire. Here are the 10 worst cars of the 1980s that killed many and proved that high-tech didn't always mean safe.
The Ford Escort of 1981 to 1990 was introduced with great fanfare as the car that would finally redeem Ford's reputation for compact, economical vehicles in the post-fuel crisis era. After the troubled Pinto and the underwhelming Fairmont, the Escort was marketed as Ford's answer to the growing influx of small, efficient imports from Japan and Europe. A car that would be practical, modern, and safe for the new decade. Ads called it the World Car, a symbol of Ford's global design unity and engineering innovation. It was supposed to bridge the gap between American comfort and European precision. Yet, what emerged from Ford's factories was a deeply compromised machine, a cheaply built, dangerously under-engineered compact that quickly became notorious not for its economy or reliability, but for its terrifying fragility in real-world crashes. From the very beginning, the Escort's safety flaws were baked into its DNA. Ford's engineers were working under immense cost pressure, and every pound of steel, every layer of reinforcement was scrutinized and often eliminated to save money and weight. The result was a structure that was perilously thin. In frontal collisions, the front crumple zones, if they could be called that, collapsed almost instantly, transmitting the energy directly into the cabin. Crash tests showed horrifying results. The steering column intruded deep into the driver's space and the dashboard folded inward with enough force to crush the driver's legs and pelvis. Test dummies recorded massive leg and chest trauma even at moderate speeds. The passenger side offered little more protection. The firewall often buckled, trapping occupants under twisted metal. It was a car that looked modern and safe, but under the sheet metal was a body shell that simply couldn't stand up to the forces of a real accident. The danger didn't stop there. Early models, especially those built between 1981 and 1984, were plagued by serious fuel system flaws. The placement of the fuel tank and filler neck left them vulnerable to rupture during rear-end collisions. The result was often fire, sudden, fierce, and nearly impossible to extinguish. Several incidents were reported where relatively minor crashes turned deadly as the Escort's tank ruptured and ignited, engulfing the car within seconds. Ford scrambled to issue recalls and redesigns, but by then the damage was done. The car's reputation was already darkened, and safety organizations began to scrutinize it more closely. Then came the steering and braking issues. Owners reported frequent steering failures, with columns that could seize mid-turn or lock entirely due to poorly designed coupling joints. Braking systems were equally unreliable, with reports of master cylinder leaks and sudden loss of hydraulic pressure. It was not uncommon for an Escort driver to find their car veering off course or unable to stop in time, especially under wet or icy conditions. Combine these mechanical flaws with the Escort's unstable handling and light weight, and it became a dangerous mix. The suspension was tuned for comfort rather than control, causing the car to pitch, bounce, and lean excessively in corners. On the highway, strong crosswinds could push it dangerously close to the edge of the lane, and in emergency maneuvers, it was prone to sudden oversteer or even spinouts. Ford's attempt to sell the Escort as a global car only made its shortcomings more visible. European versions were slightly better built, but the U.S. models, assembled quickly and cheaply to meet production targets, suffered from poor quality control. Rust became a chronic issue within just a few years of ownership, particularly in the northern states. Door seams, rocker panels, and wheel arches disintegrated, while the undercarriage often corroded so severely that critical suspension mounts failed. Some owners discovered that the subframe could separate entirely from the body, especially after winters spent on salted roads. What was marketed as a car for the modern family became, in practice, a disposable vehicle that was dangerous both in crashes and simply through daily wear. Owner experiences reflected this growing disillusionment. Many recalled how they bought the Escort because of its cheerful styling and impressive fuel economy, only to be haunted by its mechanical fragility and terrifying crash reputation. One owner in Ohio, who bought a brand new 1982 Escort GL, later told a local paper, "It felt like the car was made of aluminum foil. I hit a deer at 40 miles an hour and the front end folded like paper. The airbags didn't exist, the seatbelt snapped loose, and my knees shattered on the dashboard." Another driver from Michigan described how his Escort caught fire after a minor rear-end tap. "I barely felt the hit, but a minute later I saw smoke from the rearview mirror. Within 2 minutes the car was burning. I got out just in time." Such stories were disturbingly common, and they gave the Escort a reputation for being deceptively dangerous, a car that seemed innocent, even friendly, until the worst happened. In fairness, Ford did make incremental improvements over the years. Later versions, especially post-1985, had slightly stronger structures and better safety equipment, but by then the Escort's name had become synonymous with mediocrity and risk. Competing cars from Toyota, Honda, and Volkswagen not only outperformed it in reliability and economy, but also offered significantly better crash protection. By the late 1980s, the Escort was a relic of a transitional era, a product of cost-cutting and poor safety philosophy at a time when automakers were only beginning to take crashworthiness seriously. Today, the 1980s Ford Escort is remembered not with nostalgia, but as a cautionary tale. It represents a period when manufacturers rushed to meet new market demands without understanding the consequences of their shortcuts. It stands as proof that a car can be efficient, affordable, and popular, yet fundamentally unsafe. A world car that exposed a universal truth. When cost comes before safety, everyone pays the price. The Escort may have saved Ford's sales figures in the short term, but it cost the company something far more valuable, the trust of those who drove it.
When Chevrolet introduced the Citation in 1980, it was meant to be a triumph, a symbol of General Motors finally catching up with the rapidly changing automotive landscape. The 1970s fuel crisis had shown America that small, efficient front-wheel drive cars were the future, and GM's leadership believed the Citation would be their moonshot, a bold, forward-thinking compact that could take on the best of Europe and Japan. Advertisements called it the shape of things to come. It was the first of GM's new X-body cars, designed to replace the aging rear-wheel drive compacts of the 1970s. For a brief moment, it seemed like the company had built the perfect bridge into the 1980s. But within a year, that bridge collapsed under the weight of reality. The Chevrolet Citation didn't just fail, it became one of the most dangerous and discredited American cars ever built. On paper, the Citation had all the right ingredients. It was front-wheel drive, offered good interior space, and was lighter and more economical than the bloated V8 sedans that had dominated GM's lineup for years. Buyers loved the idea of a domestic car that felt modern and fuel-efficient, and in its first year, the Citation sold nearly 800,000 units, an enormous success. But the honeymoon didn't last long. Within months, reports began pouring in about unpredictable handling, sudden brake failures, and catastrophic loss of control. The very system that was supposed to make the Citation advanced, its new front-wheel drive layout, was catastrophically underdeveloped. The heart of the problem lay in the car's suspension and weight balance. GM's engineers had rushed the development to meet corporate deadlines, and instead of fine-tuning the design, they simply adapted old rear-wheel drive engineering ideas to a front-wheel drive configuration. The result was a car that handled more like a boat than a precision machine. The rear suspension, in particular, was dangerously unstable. Under heavy braking or sharp cornering, the rear end could swing violently out of line, a condition known as snap oversteer. Drivers described terrifying moments when the car would suddenly spin 180 degrees with no warning, even at moderate speeds. One journalist for Car and Driver famously wrote that the Citation feels like it wants to murder you in every corner. It was a car that ignored physics and expected the driver to do the same. The braking system only made matters worse. Early Citations suffered from a flaw where the rear brakes could lock up prematurely due to poor hydraulic balance, sending the car into uncontrollable skids. In panic stops, this often led to spinouts, rollovers, and collisions. GM issued several recalls between 1980 and 1983 to address the brake bias and suspension geometry, but none of the fixes truly cured the car's instability. Drivers continued to lose control, and accident reports began stacking up. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, launched multiple investigations, uncovering a disturbing pattern. The Citation's rear wheels could lose traction even in routine maneuvers like lane changes or sudden stops, especially on wet or uneven pavement. Inside the car, things weren't much better. Build quality was appalling. The dashboard rattled like a tin toy, trim pieces fell off, and transmissions failed within the first 1,000 miles. Wiring harnesses were poorly insulated, causing shorts and fires, while the carburetors often malfunctioned, leading to erratic idling and stalling in traffic. Some owners reported their cars accelerating on their own due to faulty throttle linkages, a nightmare that made driving the Citation genuinely frightening. One Michigan driver, interviewed after a crash in 1982, said, "I hit the brakes and the car spun around twice. The engine roared, the back end came loose, and I ended up facing the wrong way on the highway. I thought the car had a mind of its own." Another recalled, "I loved the way it looked, but after 3 near-death experiences, I was afraid to even drive it in the rain." Chevrolet's attempts to defend the car only deepened the public's mistrust. GM insisted that driver error was the blame for most crashes, but NHTSA's tests confirmed otherwise. The Citation's rear suspension geometry was fundamentally flawed. The trailing arm design caused abrupt shifts in alignment under load, making the rear tires break traction unpredictably. This wasn't a driver issue, it was a design catastrophe. To make matters worse, GM's cost-cutting meant that part suppliers had to meet impossible production quotas, which resulted in uneven quality between cars. Some Citations handled acceptably, while others left the factory dangerously unbalanced. As complaints multiplied, so did the recalls. By 1983, more than 500,000 Citations had been recalled for brake and steering issues alone. The NHTSA eventually issued multiple warnings about the car's safety, and insurance companies quietly began classifying it as high risk. Word spread quickly that the Citation wasn't just unreliable, it was deadly. Dealers couldn't move them off lots without massive discounts, and resale values plummeted. What had begun as GM's hope for the future became a public relations disaster. The irony is that the Citation's downfall damaged much more than just Chevrolet's image. It crippled GM's entire transition into front-wheel drive. The X-Body platform, shared with the Buick Skylark, Oldsmobile Omega, and Pontiac Phoenix, all suffered similar issues. The Phoenix, in fact, was so unstable that Consumer Reports issued a do not buy recommendation, a rare and devastating blow at the time. The entire X-Body program, once hailed as the future of American motoring, became synonymous with failure and danger. By 1985, GM quietly discontinued the Citation, replacing it with the Chevrolet Celebrity, a safer and more refined mid-size sedan. But the damage to public trust lingered for years. Many drivers who experienced the Citation firsthand never returned to a GM dealership again. Automotive historians often cite the Citation as one of the key moments when American consumers began abandoning domestic brands in favor of Japanese cars, vehicles that may have been smaller but were far more predictable, durable, and safe. Today, the Chevrolet Citation stands as one of the most infamous cautionary tales in automotive history. It represents a moment when ambition outran engineering, when marketing claimed progress but physics disagreed. It was a car that wanted to lead America into the future, but instead spun out, quite literally, into disaster. Among the forgotten wreckage of the 1980s auto industry, the Citation remains a ghost of corporate overconfidence, a reminder that innovation without integrity can kill both cars and reputations alike.
The Yugo GV was introduced to the United States in 1985 with a promise that sounded almost too good to be true. A brand new car for under $4,000. For a brief, surreal moment, it seemed like the dream of affordable motoring had returned. A car for the working class, simple and practical, built for the everyman. It was marketed as the car that anyone could own, even those who had never dreamed of buying something new. Dealerships were flooded with curiosity seekers. But within a few short years, the Yugo would go from bargain to punchline, from symbol of frugality to symbol of fear. What began as a bold socialist export from Yugoslavia became one of the most disastrously unsafe and unreliable cars ever sold in the Western world. A vehicle so poorly constructed that even minor accidents turned into scenes of horror. The Yugo story started in the small town of Kragujevac, Yugoslavia, where it was produced by the Zastava Company, an automaker with roots dating back to pre-World War II Europe. Built on a heavily modified Fiat 127 platform, the Yugo was, at its core, an outdated Italian economy car from the early 1970s that had been stripped of most of its refinements and safety features. By the time it reached American shores, its engineering was already 2 decades obsolete. But Malcolm Bricklin, the same maverick who had previously imported the Subaru 360 and produced the ill-fated Bricklin SV1, saw an opportunity. Bricklin's vision was simple: sell the cheapest new car in America. And for a short time, it worked. On the surface, the Yugo GV, short for Great Value, had a sort of naive charm. Its boxy design looked unassuming and friendly. Its small 4-cylinder engine promised good fuel economy, and its low price tag lured budget-conscious buyers who were tired of used cars. But once you actually got behind the wheel, the illusion shattered. The Yugo felt fragile, unfinished, and disturbingly unsafe even at parking lot speeds. Doors rattled, the dashboard flexed under touch, and the entire car seemed to shake like it might disintegrate at 50 miles per hour. Reviewers called it a car that feels allergic to movement. But it was crash safety, or rather the total absence of it, that earned the Yugo its dark legend. In frontal impact tests, the front structure collapsed catastrophically, pushing the engine back into the cabin and often impaling the driver with the steering column. The metal used in the body panels was so thin that it could be dented by leaning against it too hard. Seatbelts frequently jammed or failed to lock, and the interior plastics shattered into sharp shards on impact. In severe collisions, the Yugo didn't absorb energy, it simply folded. Engineers later described it as a car without a crumple zone. Even low-speed accidents could turn fatal. One horrifying NHTSA test from 1987 revealed just how fragile the Yugo was. During a standard 35-mile-per-hour frontal collision, the driver's side of the car compressed inward, almost to the seatback. The dummy's chest was crushed, and its legs were pinned under the firewall. A safety inspector reportedly remarked, "It's hard to imagine a car doing worse without exploding." It was the kind of result that would have ended most vehicles' production immediately. But the Yugo kept selling, largely because of its low price and relentless marketing. And yet, it wasn't just dangerous in crashes, it was dangerous while simply trying to drive it. The Yugo's electrical system was notoriously erratic, leading to random stalls on the highway. The carburetor was temperamental, choking on even minor impurities in the fuel. Its suspension bushings wore out within months, leading to frightening instability at high speeds. The steering column, infamous for its weak mounting, could literally break free during an accident, impaling the driver or collapsing onto their lap. Brake lines rusted through, gear linkages snapped, and ignition coils failed in cold weather. Owners often described their cars as having moods, since they never knew if it would start, stop, or die halfway home. Rust, too, was a deadly problem. Many Yugos began corroding within their first year on the road, especially in northern states where salt was used during winter. Some owners joked that they could hear it rusting overnight. The paint was so thin that even a light scratch could lead to corrosion spreading across the panel in weeks. There are reports of new Yugos failing state safety inspections less than 2 years after purchase due to structural rust, a phenomenon almost unheard of for new cars. Drivers who survived crashes often recalled terrifying experiences. One owner from Ohio told the Washington Post in 1988, "I hit a deer at about 35 miles per hour. The front end collapsed like a beer can. The hood came through the windshield, the engine dropped, and the car never started again. The only reason I'm alive is because I ducked." Another former owner said, "It was like driving fear itself. Every time I hit 50, the car started shaking like it wanted to fly apart. I was more scared of the Yugo than from any traffic around me." Mechanics were equally blunt. One described it as a car that rusts faster than it runs. Even in Europe, where small cars were common, the Yugo's safety reputation was dire. In independent crash tests conducted in the late 1980s, the Zastava 45, the European equivalent of the GV, performed so poorly that some countries considered restricting its sale. Yugoslav engineers defended the design by claiming that the car met the minimum legal standards, but those standards were decades behind global safety expectations. In the United States, it became the butt of endless jokes. Late-night comedians compared it to a disposable lighter with wheels. A common saying at the time was, "You know your car is bad when the tow truck driver knows you by name." By the early 1990s, the Yugo's reputation had collapsed entirely. The political turmoil in Yugoslavia, combined with horrifying safety results and abysmal reliability, ended its American run. When NATO bombed the Zastava factory in 1999 during the Kosovo conflict, some auto writers grimly joked that it was the only NATO strike everyone could agree on. Yet, in a strange way, the Yugo has endured as a piece of pop culture, a symbol of failed optimism. It represented the dream of cheap mobility, built on promises that cost-cutting could make cars accessible to all. But its story also serves as a warning about what happens when safety, quality, and integrity are sacrificed for price. It wasn't just unsafe. It was a car that actively betrayed the very people who trusted it. Today, seeing a Yugo on the road is almost impossible. Most have rusted away, been crushed, or burned out decades ago. But those few survivors, fragile, trembling relics of another era, remain haunting reminders of a time when America learned the hard way that sometimes the cheapest car can be the most expensive mistake of all.
The DeLorean DMC-12 was born from a dream, one that shimmered with stainless steel and futuristic optimism. But beneath that brushed metal skin, it was a deeply flawed, even dangerous reality. Few cars in history have balanced such extremes, immortalized as a pop culture legend through Back to the Future, yet remembered by those who actually owned one as a cautionary tale of compromised engineering and fatal glamour. It was a car designed to look like the future, but it handled, braked, and crashed like the past. When John Z. DeLorean announced his vision in the mid-1970s, he was already a star in the automotive world. He had been the youngest division head in General Motors history, responsible for the Pontiac GTO, the car that defined the muscle era. His next dream was more audacious, to build an ethical sports car, one that would be safe, durable, and revolutionary. The DeLorean Motor Company was born in 1975 with a promise to change how people thought about cars. It would be eco-conscious, corrosion-proof, and safe enough to survive crashes that would destroy lesser machines. The dream was intoxicating, but dreams are fragile things. By 1981, the first DeLorean DMC-12s rolled off a newly built factory line in Dunmurry, Northern Ireland. They looked like nothing else on the road. Stainless steel panels that never needed paint, gull-wing doors that rose like something out of science fiction, and a wedge profile that screamed space age. But once the first owners climbed inside, the illusion began to crumble. Beneath the stainless skin was a chassis designed by Lotus, a good starting point, but rushed into production with almost no testing. The result was a structure that flexed, squeaked, and twisted under stress. The unpainted body panels, while striking, offered little to no energy absorption in a crash. They transferred impact directly into the frame. In early crash tests, the DeLorean's weaknesses became horrifyingly clear.
The fiberglass underbody, meant to act as the structural spine, shattered in frontal collisions, leaving sharp edges that pierced the stainless panels like knives. The gull-wing doors, which were meant to symbolize freedom and innovation, became death traps when the car rolled over. If the electrical system failed, and it often did, the powered locks jammed, trapping occupants inside. Rescue workers needed special cutting tools to pry open wrecked DeLoreans. The idea of being sealed in a burning stainless steel capsule was no longer science fiction. It was a chilling reality. Even before crashes occurred, driving the DMC-12 was itself a dangerous experience. The car's weight distribution was deeply flawed, with the heavy Peugeot, Renault, Volvo V6 engine mounted behind the rear axle. This gave the DeLorean a tendency to oversteer violently, a dangerous trait for inexperienced drivers. Reviews at the time described its handling as unpredictable and snap-happy. Motor Week testers in 1981 noted that at high speeds, the rear could swing out without warning, sending the car spinning off the road. And because the brakes were poorly balanced, trying to correct such a slide often made things worse. The steering was slow, the suspension underdamped, and the tires struggled to grip under pressure. It looked like a supercar, but drove like a poorly tuned kit car. Visibility, too, was a cruel joke. The DeLorean's sloping roofline and tiny rear window created enormous blind spots. Drivers often found themselves unable to see merging traffic or pedestrians until it was too late. At night, the weak headlights made the road ahead vanish into darkness, while the stainless bodywork reflected light awkwardly, sometimes blinding other drivers. It was, in many ways, a car that prioritized form so completely that function became an afterthought. And then there was the electrical system, a tangle of unreliable British wiring that made every drive a gamble. Owners reported doors failing to open, lights flickering, gauges dying mid-drive, and complete system shutdowns at highway speed. The engine, underpowered and strangled by emissions controls, made only about 130 horsepower, far too little for the car's weight. In an era of turbocharged Porsches and nimble Corvettes, the DeLorean felt slow and clumsy. Some journalists joked that it was a car that looks like it could go 200 miles per hour, but barely manages 100. Crashes involving the DMC-12 were particularly grisly. One California accident in 1982 demonstrated just how dangerous the car could be. After a moderate front-end collision, the door structure twisted so severely that the driver was trapped for nearly half an hour before emergency crews could cut him free. The car's fuel tank, located dangerously close to the nose, ruptured easily, leading to several fire-related fatalities. Because of the stainless panels, fire spread quickly along the body, heating the metal until it glowed. Survivors described the sensation of being inside a metal coffin. Owners who had bought into the dream began turning on the company. Complaints piled up about stalling engines, misaligned doors, and unreliable electronics. One frustrated DeLorean driver summed it up bitterly in a 1983 interview. "It's the best-looking bad car ever made. Every time I park it, people stare and take pictures. They just don't know I had to push it there." Another wrote to Road and Track, calling the car an ergonomic nightmare, a safety hazard, and a monument to bad engineering. The final blow came when John DeLorean himself was arrested in 1982 for alleged cocaine trafficking, a desperate attempt to raise money for his collapsing company. Though he was later acquitted, the brand's reputation was destroyed. Fewer than 9,000 DMC-12s were ever built, and the company went bankrupt within 2 years of its first production car. Yet despite its disastrous reality, the DeLorean found redemption not in the real world, but in fiction. In 1985, Back to the Future turned the car into a cultural icon, forever linking it to time travel, adventure, and youthful imagination. On screen, it became a symbol of limitless possibility, a vehicle that transcended time. But for those who actually drove one, it remained a symbol of something far less noble, the danger of style over substance. Today, the DeLorean DMC-12 is cherished by collectors and movie fans alike, its flaws forgiven in the name of nostalgia. But make no mistake, beneath that brushed steel, it is still a deeply unsafe car. Its structure is fragile, its crash behavior unpredictable, and its design fatally compromised by ambition. It is the perfect example of how dreams can burn too brightly, consuming everything, including safety, in the pursuit of immortality. Cool on screen, yes, but in the real world, it was a gleaming, stainless steel death trap masquerading as the future. The Hyundai Excel arrived in America in 1985 like a bright new promise. A budget-friendly import from South Korea that claimed to offer modern engineering and efficiency for the price of a used car. It was the first Hyundai ever sold in the United States, a bold attempt to challenge the established Japanese automakers who had already perfected the small car formula. The advertising was confident, the styling looked contemporary, and the $4,995 base price was almost too good to be true. Unfortunately, it was. The Excel soon proved that the bargain had been struck with the devil, and that every dollar saved at the dealership would be paid back tenfold in frustration, danger, and broken parts. By the end of the decade, the Excel would become synonymous with cheapness, unreliability, and the kind of structural weakness that could turn a fender bender into a life-threatening disaster. At its heart, the Excel was built on good intentions but dreadful execution. Hyundai's engineers had experience producing licensed versions of older Fords and Mitsubishis in Korea, and the Excel's design borrowed heavily from Mitsubishi's Mirage platform. On paper, that should have ensured at least modest reliability and safety. But Hyundai cut corners everywhere. Thinner steel, weaker welds, and minimal corrosion protection, all to keep costs low. American crash testers quickly discovered just how dangerous those compromises were. In low-speed frontal collisions, the Excel's crumple zones didn't crumple, they shattered. The front subframe folded under the cabin, driving the engine into the firewall. The steering column, meant to collapse safely, often shot backward toward the driver. Airbags were non-existent, and even seatbelt mounts were prone to tearing away from the floor. The result was a car that performed disastrously in almost every kind of crash. During one infamous Insurance Institute for Highway Safety test, the front end of the Excel folded like a soda can, with the windshield popping out completely and the roofline bending downward. The dummy's knees slammed into the dashboard, while the steering wheel crushed into the chest area. Engineers watching the test called it one of the worst structural failures we've ever seen in a production car. Even in minor parking lot fender benders, the Excel's bumpers were known to crack or detach entirely, exposing sharp metal edges. Owners soon realized that the car didn't just lack protection, it actively endangered anyone inside. The safety issues were only part of the problem. The Excel's body panels were so thin that door dings could create full creases. Rust began forming on brand new cars within a year, particularly in northern states where road salt was common. Suspension components failed at alarming rates, with control arms and tie rods breaking under normal driving conditions. Mechanics joked that the Excel was built from recycled refrigerator doors, and some weren't far off. The metal was cheap, brittle, and poorly treated. The frame flexed so much that windshields cracked from normal body movement. Even the paint was prone to peeling, revealing bare metal beneath that corroded almost instantly. Driving an Excel was a lesson in compromise. Its 1.5-liter engine made just 68 horsepower and struggled to move the lightweight shell, especially with the air conditioning on. Acceleration from 0 to 60 miles per hour took over 14 seconds, and the engine screamed like a sewing machine on the highway. The suspension, already fragile, offered a harsh and jittery ride, while the steering was vague and unresponsive. Braking distances were dangerously long due to undersized drums and thin rotors that warped easily. On wet roads, the car understeered severely, and its light rear end made it prone to spinning if the driver lifted off the throttle too quickly. The tires, narrow and low quality, only made matters worse. A journalist from Motor Trend famously described the Excel as a car that feels like it's been pre-wrecked. Owners quickly realized that the Excel's low purchase price was a trap. Within a year, many reported blown head gaskets, failed transmissions, and suspension collapses.
Some cars were junked before even reaching 40,000 miles. One owner from Ohio told Consumer Reports in 1987, "It's like the car is allergic to being driven. Everything breaks, everything." Another lamented that their Excel handled like a shopping cart full of bricks, and added, "I've never been so scared merging onto a freeway." Dealerships became overwhelmed with warranty claims, and Hyundai's parts supply couldn't keep up. The car's reputation deteriorated so quickly that even rental companies refused to buy them. Budget Rent-A-Car publicly announced in 1988 that it would no longer include the Excel in its fleet, citing catastrophic reliability issues and frequent structural failures. Insurance companies quietly raised premiums for Excel owners after data showed unusually high injury rates in accidents involving the car. Word spread fast, and resale values plummeted. Used Excels, barely 3 years old, were selling for under $1,000, less than many bicycles today. The irony of its name was not lost on anyone. Excel suggested achievement and quality, yet the car excelled only at collapsing, in every sense. Its frame collapsed in crashes, its suspension collapsed on rough roads, and its reputation collapsed in record time. Even Hyundai executives later admitted that the Excel nearly destroyed their brand in America. It would take more than a decade of rebuilding, culminating in the late 1990s Elantra and Sonata, before Hyundai regained any credibility. And yet, despite its abysmal legacy, the Excel played an odd role in automotive history. It was the first mass-produced South Korean car sold in America, a symbol of a nation trying to prove itself on the global stage. It opened the door for future generations of Hyundai and Kia models that would eventually become some of the most reliable cars in the world. But that transformation came at a heady cost, paid by those who trusted the first Excel. For them, the dream of an affordable modern import turned into a daily struggle against rust, mechanical failure, and constant fear on the highway. Today, almost none survive. The thin steel and poor build quality ensured that most Excels disintegrated long ago, either in junkyards or simply into the earth. Spotting one today is like finding a fossil, a reminder of a time when affordable often meant disposable. The Hyundai Excel stands as one of the clearest examples of how not to build a car. It was a machine that promised progress but delivered peril, a vehicle that embodied ambition undone by inexperience. Cheap to buy, costly to survive. It was, quite literally, a car that excelled only at falling apart.
When the Pontiac Fiero debuted in 1984, it was hailed as a revolution for the American car industry, a sleek, mid-engine two-seater built by General Motors, a company better known for bloated sedans and uninspired family cars. On paper, it was everything enthusiasts had dreamed of for decades, a sporty, affordable, fuel-efficient car that put the engine behind the driver, evoking the layout of Ferraris and Lamborghinis. At last, the average American could have an exotic car experience without needing a trust fund. Pontiac even advertised it with the slogan, "We build excitement." Unfortunately, what they actually built was one of the most dangerously flawed cars of the 1980s, a machine that, quite literally, lived up to the promise of excitement by spontaneously bursting into flames. The Fiero's story began with good intentions. GM engineers originally designed it as a high-efficiency commuter car, using lightweight materials and a small four-cylinder engine to maximize fuel economy during the energy crisis era. The mid-engine placement wasn't about performance at first, it was about packaging efficiency. But Pontiac's marketing department saw something else, a chance to revive the brand's image as a builder of excitement and power. So the humble commuter design was rebranded as a sports car before production even began. The result was a confused machine, engineered for economy but sold for performance, a contradiction that would prove disastrous. The car's structure was innovative on the surface. It used a space frame made of steel with bolt-on plastic body panels, a concept borrowed from GM's experience with Saturn prototypes. The plastic panels didn't rust and were cheap to replace, but they also added little to the car's structural rigidity. Beneath that futuristic shell lay decades-old parts from GM's inventory. The suspension was a mix and match of components from the Chevy Chevette and Pontiac Citation. hardly the stuff of a mid-engine sports car. The result was handling that was twitchy and unpredictable, especially at high speeds. Early reviewers noted the Fiero felt nervous in corners, prone to sudden oversteer if the driver lifted off the throttle. But the real disaster came from what sat behind the driver, a 2.5-liter Iron Duke four-cylinder borrowed from GM's budget sedans. It produced just 92 horsepower and wasn't designed to handle the heat demands of a mid-engine layout. To fit it into the Fiero's cramped bay, GM had to reroute the cooling and oil systems, creating an engine compartment with dangerously tight clearances and poor airflow. The result was catastrophic. Oil leaks from worn seals and cracked valve covers dripped directly onto the hot exhaust manifold. And because the engine sat only inches behind the driver's seat, a small leak could turn into a blazing inferno in seconds. Within the first year of production, reports began to surface of Fieros catching fire on the road, sometimes while idling, sometimes at highway speeds, and occasionally while parked. Owners described seeing smoke billow from behind them before flames engulfed the car. In one infamous case, a nearly new Fiero burned to the ground in a dealership lot before it could even be sold. By 1987, more than 200 confirmed engine fire incidents had been documented, though insiders claimed the real number was far higher. General Motors initially blamed owners for poor maintenance, insisting they had let their cars run low on oil. But the truth was, the engine's design consumed oil rapidly, and even careful owners were at risk. Under public pressure and growing lawsuits, GM finally issued a massive recall in 1988, admitting that oil leaks and overheating were inherent flaws in the design. Mechanics were instructed to install new connecting rods, valve cover gaskets, and better heat shielding. But by then, the damage was done, both literally and figuratively. Pontiac's dream of a halo car turned into a PR nightmare. The media dubbed it the world's only self-cooking sports car, and late-night comedians joked that owning a Fiero meant you'd better keep a fire extinguisher in the glove box. Even aside from the fires, the Fiero was far from safe. The plastic body panels, while innovative, offered almost no impact protection. In collisions, the car's lightweight frame twisted and collapsed easily. Crash tests showed the steering column and dashboard could intrude dangerously into the cabin, while the low-mounted fuel tank, ironically intended to improve balance, was vulnerable in side impacts. With the engine so close to the passenger compartment, even minor accidents could send superheated oil and metal into the cabin area. Drivers were often trapped inside when electrical failures rendered the door mechanisms useless. Yet the tragedy of the Fiero was that beneath all the flaws lay the potential for greatness. The car's layout was ideal for handling, and in its final year, Pontiac finally gave it the power it always deserved. The 1988 Fiero GT received a proper V6 engine, a redesigned suspension, and upgraded brakes, turning it into the balanced, thrilling sports car it was always meant to be. By then, however, the fires had destroyed its reputation. Sales collapsed, and GM quietly killed the program after just 5 years. Fewer than 400,000 units were built, and many of those burned or rusted away long before reaching old age. Owners from the era recall the experience with a mix of affection and fear. One 1985 owner told Car and Driver, "It was the most exciting car I ever drove, because I never knew if I'd make it home." Another recounted a terrifying moment when smoke began to pour into the cabin. "I thought it was the heater at first, but then I saw the rear window glowing orange. I bailed out seconds before the whole car went up." Fire departments across the country reportedly knew exactly what to expect when they saw a Fiero burning, an engine bay completely engulfed before the driver even opened the door. In hindsight, the Pontiac Fiero stands as one of the most fascinating failures in automotive history. It was an experiment born from ambition and ruined by corporate corner-cutting. GM had the chance to create a true American sports car, something bold and original. Instead, they built a cautionary tale, a car that literally burned its way into infamy. Today, the Fiero survives as a cult collectible, especially the final year V6 models that finally lived up to their promise. Enthusiasts restore them lovingly, often with modern engines and upgraded cooling systems to banish the ghosts of their fiery past. But no matter how well restored, the Fiero's legend remains inseparable from the flames that defined it. It was the car that dreamed of being a Ferrari, but instead became a fire hazard on wheels. A symbol of how bold innovation can turn deadly when rushed, underfunded, and misunderstood. In the end, the Pontiac Fiero wasn't just a car that caught fire. It was a car that burned bright, fast, and tragically. A brief spark of brilliance consumed by its own ambition. When the Fiat Strada, known in most of Europe as the Fiat Ritmo, was unveiled in 1978, it was supposed to represent a new era for the Italian automaker. Fiat, then one of the world's largest car manufacturers, wanted to prove it could embrace cutting-edge automation and futuristic design. The company proudly announced that the Strada was built by robots, a slogan that sounded like science fiction in an age when most cars were still assembled by hand. The television commercials were stunning for their time. Robotic arms welded, painted, and assembled an entire car to the rhythm of synthesized music. It was sleek, modern, and progressive, at least in theory. But in practice, the Fiat Strada would go down as one of the worst-built, least safe, and most rust-prone cars of its decade. A vehicle that managed to destroy Fiat's credibility in several markets and nearly became a symbol of why automation couldn't replace human craftsmanship. The Strada's design wasn't the problem. In fact, stylistically, it was ahead of its time. Created by Bertoni, it featured soft curves, distinctive round headlights, and a unique, almost sculptural hatchback profile. Inside, it was airy and practical with plenty of visibility and a modular dashboard that felt futuristic compared to its contemporaries. Fiat engineers envisioned it as a successor to the wildly popular 128, combining small car efficiency with family practicality. It was meant to rival the Volkswagen Golf, Ford Escort, and Renault 14, the emerging wave of front-wheel drive compacts that would dominate Europe in the late 1970s and 1980s. But that dream began to unravel almost immediately. Fiat's Mirafiori factory in Turin, where the Strada was produced, was among the first plants in the world to integrate large-scale robotic welding. Unfortunately, the technology was in its infancy, and Fiat rushed to deploy it before the systems were fully refined. The robots performed welds inconsistently, often missing joints or overheating panels. Human inspectors, already reduced in number due to automation, failed to catch many of these defects. The result was shocking. Cars left the factory with incomplete welds, warped doors, and misaligned panels. One early reviewer from the UK magazine Autocar noted that the doors on their test car did not line up even on the same day it was built, while another quipped that the Strada seemed to have been assembled on a Monday morning by a robot that was still learning what a car was. Then came the rust. Fiat had a long-standing reputation for poor corrosion protection, but the Strada elevated that problem to an art form. Within 2 or 3 years, brand-new Stradas were showing bubbling paint and holes in the floor. In Northern Europe, where roads were salted in winter, it wasn't uncommon for the wheel arches and sills to disintegrate entirely. Owners joked that you could hear your Strada rusting if you parked it near the sea. British dealers reported entire fleets of unsold cars developing rust in storage. The irony was painful. A car built by robots, marketed as the future of precision manufacturing, couldn't even survive a season without turning into scrap metal. Safety was another catastrophe. Fiat's engineers, focused on lightweight construction and cost-cutting, used extremely thin sheet metal and minimal reinforcement in the passenger shell. The result was a body structure that collapsed with alarming ease. In European crash tests, the Strada performed disastrously. In low-speed front impacts, the crumple zones barely absorbed any energy. Instead, the steering column and dashboard were driven back toward the driver. Side impacts were even worse. In one infamous test, the driver's door separated completely from the frame at just 30 kilometers per hour, and the roof buckled so severely that the dummy's head struck the metal above the windshield. Italian engineers claimed these were isolated test issues, but real-world crashes told the same story. The car offered almost no protection. Even when it wasn't falling apart or rusting through, the Strada was plagued by countless mechanical and electrical issues. Wiring harnesses were poorly insulated, leading to shorts, blown fuses, and spontaneous fires behind the dashboard. Carburetors leaked, ignition systems failed in damp weather, and the suspension bushings wore out after a few thousand miles. The Fiat's once innovative robotic precision had devolved into chaos. Each car seemed slightly different from the next, as if every robot had its own idea of how to build one. British, German, and American reviewers were merciless. The U.S. version, briefly sold through Fiat's American subsidiary, became so infamous for unreliability that Consumer Reports ranked it near the bottom of all vehicles tested in the early 1980s, describing its build quality as shockingly poor even for small car standards. There are also stories from owners that bordered on absurd. One British buyer recalled that after just 2 months, his Strada's driver's side door fell off when he opened it on a windy day. Another reported the gear lever snapping off mid-drive. A mechanic in Milan famously said, "You don't repair a Strada, you negotiate with it." Yet with its flaws, some enthusiasts tried to see the humor in owning one. It was cheap, quirky, and undeniably Italian. And when it worked, it had a certain charm. The 1.3 and 1.5-liter engines were lively, and the car handled well enough on twisty roads, at least until the suspension mounts began to separate from the frame. The car's reputation, however, was beyond saving. In export markets like the UK and the US, sales plummeted. Dealers began refusing to stock them, and in some regions, insurance companies charged higher premiums simply because of the car's known structural weakness. Fiat attempted to refresh the Strada in the early 1980s with a facelift, better corrosion treatment, and upgraded engines, but the damage was irreversible. The "Built by Robots" slogan, once a boast, became a punchline. As one German automotive journalist dryly observed, Fiat's robots have learned to make cars as badly as humans. By the late 1980s, Fiat quietly retired the model. Its replacement, the Tipo, was far better engineered and more solidly built. The company had finally learned from its mistakes. But the Strada left scars. In the US, Fiat's reputation was so tarnished that the brand withdrew entirely from the market by 1983, not to return until nearly 30 years later. Today, the Fiat Strada, or Ritmo, exists mostly as a curiosity from an era when technology outpaced wisdom. It was a bold idea executed disastrously, a car that embodied both the optimism and the arrogance of late 1970s automotive engineering. A handful of enthusiasts still collect them, drawn by nostalgia or by the car's distinctively Italian styling, but most have long since rusted back into the earth they came from. The Fiat Strada was supposed to be a glimpse of the future, precision-built, efficient, and modern. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting machines before they were ready, and of marketing perfection before you've earned it. It was, in every sense, a car that looked forward but fell apart before it could get there.
The Renault Alliance, produced between 1983 and 1987 as a joint venture between American Motors Corporation and Renault, was pitched as a small, efficient, and stylish compact that would bring European elegance to American streets. On paper, it had all the right ingredients: a sleek body, economical engines, and an interior that felt modern compared to many domestic compacts of the early 1980s. It even won Motor Trend's Car of the Year in 1983, a distinction that only served to highlight the gap between marketing promises and harsh reality. For drivers, the Alliance quickly became infamous not for sophistication, but for fragility, unreliability, and, in the most extreme cases, outright danger. The car's styling was undeniably European, with clean lines, wedge-shaped proportions, and a minimalistic dashboard that looked more like something from Paris than Detroit.
Early reviews praised its fuel economy and nimble handling in city traffic. Unfortunately, these superficial positives could not compensate for the mechanical and structural flaws lurking beneath. The electrical system in particular was notoriously unreliable. Dash instruments would fail, headlights flickered unpredictably, and wiring harnesses were prone to short circuits that could leave drivers stranded without warning. Owners often recounted tales of dashboards dying mid-drive, fuses blowing for no apparent reason, and connections melting under normal operating conditions. Worse, the car's steering system was fragile. Steering racks could snap under stress, particularly in sharp turns or under heavy use, sending the car unpredictably off course. Suspension components, designed to be light and economical, had a tendency to collapse in rear-end collisions. Combined with a lack of reinforcements in the cabin, these weaknesses meant that even moderate impacts could have catastrophic results. Crash testing at the time revealed that occupants were subject to dangerously high deceleration forces, meaning that a seemingly minor collision could cause severe injuries or death. The Alliance's structure, thin and under-engineered, provided almost no protection against side impacts, and in frontal crashes, the steering column often intruded toward the driver's chest. In short, a car marketed as safe and refined could in reality be described as a rolling hazard. Mechanically, the car fared little better. The small Renault-sourced engines were often plagued with overheating, oil leaks, and worn-out timing chains. Clutch failures were frequent, and the transmissions were prone to grinding and premature wear. Even routine maintenance could become a nightmare because replacement parts were hard to find, particularly in the United States, where AMC had hoped to blend European design with domestic reliability. Owners described the experience as a constant battle. The car's charm vanished under layers of frustration, breakdowns, and fear for personal safety. Despite these glaring flaws, the Alliance sold reasonably well at first, buoyed by marketing, fuel economy concerns during the early 1980s, and its initial Car of the Year accolade. But word of mouth quickly spread. Mechanics, insurance adjusters, and automotive journalists were uniformly blunt. The Renault Alliance was fragile, unsafe, and prone to failures that could turn a short trip into a roadside nightmare. By the mid-1980s, its reputation tanked, sales plummeted, and Renault pulled back its presence in the American market. Today, the Renault Alliance is remembered less for style or economy and more as a cautionary tale of what happens when European design elegance meets under-engineered execution. In the end, the Alliance delivered one consistent lesson. Appearances can be deceptive, and a car marketed as European sophistication can, in reality, be a gamble that leaves drivers paying the ultimate price.
By the early 1980s, the Chevrolet Chevette had become a stark reminder of how quickly automotive safety standards had evolved and how some cars had lagged far behind. Introduced in 1976 as GM's answer to small, fuel-efficient imports, the Chevette was initially celebrated for its affordability and simplicity. On paper, it offered a no-frills approach to transportation, a small, lightweight body, modest four-cylinder engine, and basic suspension. But beneath this practical exterior lay a series of design compromises that made the Chevette dangerously inadequate in any serious collision. The car's crash structure was rudimentary, even by the standards of the late 1970s. The thin steel body lacked any meaningful crumple zones, meaning that in a frontal impact, energy was transmitted almost directly to the occupants. The steering column, solid and unyielding, became a potential spear in moderate collisions, threatening serious injury to drivers. Side impacts were even worse. The Chevette's door locks were notoriously unreliable, and numerous reports indicated that in collisions, doors could fly open, throwing occupants into traffic. The thin metal panels provided almost no energy absorption, and the cabin itself offered minimal protection. Combined with a lack of reinforced side structures or airbags, which were years away from being standard, the car was fundamentally unsafe. Mechanically, the Chevette was inexpensive and easy to repair, which initially appealed to buyers seeking economy. Its small engine was adequate for city driving, and its light weight allowed for modest fuel efficiency. But the very traits that made it economical, its lightweight frame and minimalistic design, also made it a hazard. The suspension and chassis were tuned for cost and simplicity, not for stability or crashworthiness. At higher speeds, the Chevette could feel twitchy, and braking distances were longer than desirable. Its simplicity, once a virtue, became a liability when combined with outdated engineering and inadequate safety measures. Owners from that era often recounted experiences that underlined its fragility. Even minor fender benders could result in twisted frames and jammed doors. Insurance adjusters and mechanics warned that the car's body could collapse alarmingly in side or front impacts. While it was cheap to purchase and easy to maintain, the cost and personal safety was immeasurable. Public perception shifted quickly, and the Chevette became a symbol of the dangers of ultra-low-cost design compromises in an era when safety regulations were just beginning to catch up. By the time the Chevette carried over into the early 1980s, it was already hopelessly outdated, both in design and safety. The car's charm as an economical, lightweight commuter vanished in the face of its glaring structural deficiencies. What remained was a vehicle that could carry people from point A to point B, but with every mile, it quietly reminded drivers that cost savings had come at a perilous price. In hindsight, the Chevette serves as a grim illustration of how neglecting occupant protection can turn even a simple, practical car into a potential death trap.
The Lada Riva, officially the Vaz 2105, stands as one of the most infamous examples of automotive design where cost-cutting and ideological priorities overrode even the most basic principles of occupant safety. Launched in 1980 as the Soviet Union sought to modernize its fleet, the Riva was exported far beyond Eastern Europe, reaching Western Europe and a few North American markets, often touted as a cheap, reliable alternative to the Western small sedan. Yet behind its unassuming, boxy exterior lay a vehicle that could best be described as a rolling death trap, a machine where simplicity came at a terrifying human cost. At first glance, the Riva seemed competent. A conventional four-door sedan with a familiar layout, straightforward controls, and a mechanical simplicity that promised ease of repair and longevity. Mechanics and parts were intentionally basic, allowing owners and local garages to perform repairs without advanced tools or knowledge. However, this simplicity masked catastrophic flaws in design. The body panels were extraordinarily thin, barely more than foil in some areas, and offered almost no protection in a collision. Frontal impacts transmitted almost all of their energy directly to the cabin, with the metal folding in on itself rather than crumpling safely. Side collisions were even more dangerous. The Riva lacked internal reinforcements, and its doors could be ripped open or crushed entirely. The steering column, a rigid and unsafe design, could break free in a serious crash, impaling the driver. Seatbelts, if present at all in early models, were rudimentary and unreliable, and the car had virtually no crumple zones to absorb impact forces. A minor collision that modern cars would survive easily could turn into a catastrophic, often fatal event in a Lada Riva. The Riva's chassis and suspension were stiff and simplistic, engineered more for durability on the often brutal roads of the Soviet Union than for driver protection. While this rigidity made the car reliable in terms of maintaining its shape on rough terrain or surviving decades of hard use, it also meant that the car had almost no flexibility to absorb shocks in a collision. Brake performance was limited and prone to fade on long descents, and handling could become twitchy and unpredictable when fully loaded. Owners often reported that the car felt stable only at slow urban speeds. Any attempt at highway driving revealed its weak structural integrity and vague, unresponsive steering. In emergency maneuvers, the Riva could understeer or oversteer unpredictably, and with its minimal grip and heavy body, the result was often catastrophic.
The car's reputation in the Eastern Bloc reflected these dangers. Locals called it the coffin with wheels, a grim acknowledgement of the countless accidents where the Riva's fragile frame magnified injuries that would have been minor in better-designed vehicles. Despite its mechanical durability, engines and transmissions that could last decades with minimal care, the car offered almost no real protection to its occupants. Even simple fender benders could result in serious injuries, while higher-speed crashes were almost universally deadly. Survival often depended on luck rather than engineering. Internationally, the Riva was exported and marketed as a budget-friendly, reliable car. But this exterior promise was deceiving. Western crash tests quickly revealed the horrors hidden beneath its utilitarian surface. A car that could collapse in slow collisions, doors that could detach, and a steering column that could impale its driver. In markets unfamiliar with the extremes of Soviet manufacturing priorities, these flaws were shocking, yet they went largely unaddressed because the car's primary design goal was to maximize affordability and simplicity, not safety. By the time production ended in 1997, the Lada Riva had achieved legendary status, though not for the reasons its creators had hoped. It became a symbol of Soviet-era pragmatism and compromise. A car that could be fixed anywhere with basic tools, could survive decades of neglect and harsh conditions, and was ubiquitous on roads from Moscow to rural Eastern Europe. Yet this reliability came at a horrifying cost. Its near-total lack of occupant protection, flimsy structure, unsafe steering, and unpredictable handling made every journey a gamble with mortality. For generations of drivers and passengers, the Riva was more than just a car. It was a test of endurance, resilience, and luck. In the annals of automotive history, it stands as a chilling reminder that engineering a vehicle for affordability and simplicity without prioritizing safety can create a machine that is not only obsolete, but deadly. A rolling coffin that nevertheless carried millions across continents for nearly 2 decades.